Hello and welcome to Perspectives. I'm Setareh. We devote our program today to women, not just in honor of International Women's Day, but because the welfare of women affects everybody in society. It's not an opinion, but a fact that holding back women holds back economic progress. President Obama created the position of Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues in 2009. We will introduce you to the dedicated woman who has held that position since then and get the American perspective on women in public office from a senator who began her career in state politics. We start with a ceremony last week at the U.S. Department of State in honor of some extraordinary women from around the world. On International Women's Day, First Lady Michelle Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton paid tribute to 10 international women of courage from around the world. The annual award recognizes the honorees' exceptional courage and leadership in advocating for women's rights.
They come from diverse and distant places, but in one important way, they all walk the same path. They too are working tirelessly for justice. They are working for accountability. They are working for freedom. And they are working tirelessly to improve the lives of women and girls.
They saw corruption and they worked to expose it. They saw oppression and they worked to end it. They saw violence, poverty, discrimination, and inequality. And they decided to use their voices and risk their lives to do something about it.
The two Nobel Peace Prize laureates of 2012 were special guests, Tawakkol Karman of Yemen and Leima Bowie of Liberia.
We honor and applaud you.
These honorees include an investigative journalist, a member of parliament, and a police officer, as well as political and human rights activists.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for coming here, and thank you very much for giving us your time.
It's my pleasure indeed.
May I start with the Third Billion campaign? Why is it a new departure, and what are its goals?
Well, the Third Billion campaign is a recognition that there is so much untapped talent around the world that women possess. It is predicated on a study that showed that there are some almost 900 million women who, because of lack of opportunity, lack of education, lack of access to the kinds of things that enable them to go forward, are being shortchanged. Not only are they being shortchanged, our world is being shortchanged in the process because their talent is not being tapped. And so it's an effort to call on corporations and civil society and others in positions to do something to close this gap. You know, Secretary Clinton often says, talent is universal, but opportunity is not.
Would you please explain how shared value works in this country and also in developing countries?
So take a company like Avon, for example, which is known for selling cosmetics to women. They have really associated their brand with the fight against violence against women and the fight to cure breast cancer. So that when one thinks of the company, it doesn't only think of its products, it thinks also of the good it is doing to champion these causes.
And it is making a difference.
It's making a huge difference for them and their bottom line. Women are obviously critically important to our world, but they're also good for business. And so associating not just business opportunity, business profits, what businesses do well, but also recognizing the social good that could be done. But it's very intertwined, and it's a shared value. Mm-hmm. Sharing, making business progress, but sharing, making social progress.
How could we make women aware of their rights, especially in the Middle East, in South Asia? They do have some rights, even though these are patriarchal societies, and there are outspoken women. How could there be a voice also for regular, other, ordinary women?
Women in some of the poorest places may not know about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, one's rights are not conditioned on where one lives or one's religion or one's economic status. And yet you're exactly right. So many women are not aware that there are things that they can do to enable their condition to change. Even in Morocco, when they passed family law reform, the Mudawana reform, it was a very important step forward that took literally years and years and years to pass, and some of those who struggled for the reform were imprisoned along the way. But the day came and it was very clear that this reform was totally consistent with their religious values. But then the hard work needed to take place. Judges needed to be educated.
So the value of education also is so
The
very,
value
very
of
important
education
for women.
is critical, and we can't divorce education from rights awareness. There is this wonderful story, Mukhtar Mai, maybe somebody you remember, this woman in Pakistan who was terribly abused. She was gang raped, and somehow she mustered the courage to do something about her situation. And she, in the end, after taking her court case, got a small settlement. And what she did with that money, I thought, was extremely instructive. She set up a school for girls and a school for boys in her village. And when asked why she did this, she said, because nothing will ever change without education.
तो उसने एक सेकंड नहीं लगाया, एक सेकंड में मेरी जिंदगी बर्बाद कर दी.
So when I heard about the acid violence in my homeland, I said, I must do something.
Pakistan won its first Academy Award this year with a documentary that takes an unflinching look at violence against women. Acid attacks have been tolerated, not just in Pakistan, but elsewhere in South Asia. The film shows the terrible results of this brutality and the efforts of a dedicated plastic surgeon to help the victims. But it also documents the successful campaign by women to finally get a law passed that makes this violence a crime.
मैं बहुत खुश हूँ और अल्लाह ताला का लाख दफ़ा शुक्र अदा करती हूँ कि मेरी जो ख्वाहिश थी वो पूरी होने वाली है.
What was truly compelling was the fact that the victims were willing and able to talk about their situation. They had that kind of courage that it took to speak about it. So I think that that film has had an impact, could potentially have a greater impact, but just in the making of it, I think conveys to both people in Pakistan and beyond that steps are being taken to really say enough already.
There have been cases of acid attacks in Iran also. I wanted to get your assessment on the situation of women in Iran. You know, they were quite active after the 2009 presidential elections, what was called the Green Movement. What is your assessment of their situation right now?
Well, I think the women in Iran have been on the front lines of trying to make progress and change in their society. There was the million signatures petition that took place in Iran, and I think in many ways there has been a reaction to that, but the women nevertheless went out in great numbers to get those signatures that basically called for the recognition and protection of one's rights and the kind of reforms that were critical. So I think in many ways the women of Iran, many of them, have been profiles in courage. They have been leaders. They have been on the front lines, and I'm sure an inspiration to so many.
Women played an integral part in the so-called Arab Spring uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, even in the face of brutal crackdowns by state security forces. We have another example of the courage and activism women are showing on the front lines of change. VOA's Elizabeth Arrett reports from Sana'a, Yemen.
Much of what the world has seen of the Arab uprisings this past year has come from the people living through them. These citizen journalists helped to spread the word and images of the protests. In Yemen, from an apartment near Sana'a's Change Square, Nadia Abdullah watched the demonstrations unfold.
My father gave me a camera and told me, "This is in case there's any attack on youth. You film it, and then we can send it to the media channels."
Even documenting the unrest from home was a big step, she says, for her conservative father.
I didn't imagine that my father, brother, or the family would accept that I go out and do an interview on camera. This was almost impossible to do because of the norms and traditions. They're closed and conservative conditions. It's not proper for a woman to appear in public.
Inspired by the revolution below her window, she did go out, eventually with her father's blessing. The revolution, she says, changed everything.
I followed news when it happened and shot what is happening in the squares of conferences, forums, demonstrations, inside or outside.
She documented the crackdown by government troops.
The bullet went through his head, and he became a martyr. This was a very difficult situation. When one of the youths dies in front of my eyes, it really affected me.
She captured heartbreaking grief, but also quieter moments, both in video and still photos.
I took this photo on the 27th of Ramadan during prayers.
Abdullah says she was determined to show the true face of protesters the government labeled thugs.
With a camera and a picture, you can silence anyone. You show them a live video, and they cannot speak.
Ultimately, the protesters and the citizen journalists who told their story helped to topple the nation's longtime ruler. For Nadia, now pursuing a journalism career, they brought down barriers for Yemeni women as well. Elizabeth Arrett, VOA News, Sana'a.
And let's talk about the Arab Spring. Women have participated in these demonstrations. In Yemen, we have seen a woman also got the Nobel Peace. What could women do to be more active in the political process and political participation of the country? It seems that they have been pushed aside.
Well, I think there have been different situations that have emanated from Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya since the so-called Arab Spring events occurred. Tunisia now has, approximately a third of its parliament is women. In Libya, there have been efforts to set the election laws, and after the third try, it looks like they're going to have real opportunities to have, men's names, then women's names in a zippered kind of fashion, we call it, so that they'll have a real comparable opportunity. Egypt is the big disappointment. And I think what has happened there, women were on Tahrir Square, shoulder to shoulder with the men. They were an extraordinary positive influence. And it seems from the beginning of the transitional government, every effort has made to just push them aside. And there have been significant pushbacks. I think there'll be something like 8 women, if that many, in the parliament since the election.
I'd like to quote something you have said. No effort to advance sustainable development will succeed that does not take into account half of the world's population. Women have long been promoting solutions to sustainable development challenges, promoting climate change, biodiversity, and so forth. Would you give us some examples of that?
Take the example of cook stoves, for example, clean cook stoves. In so much of the world, women cook in conditions that are not only very detrimental because of the black carbon to the air, but very detrimental to their health and their family's health. In fact, the respiratory diseases that emanate from the way that cooking is done in many places around the world is one of the biggest contributors to death and to very serious illness. And so the ability to move from dirty cook stoves, if you will, to a cleaner version is in the interests of health and the environment. But it's also a way that women today are economically empowering themselves. They are not only selling clean cook stoves, they have created viable businesses maintaining them. And we're finding that while women are severely impacted by these severe changes in environment, they're also absolutely critical actors in adapting to the situation with new ways of, like in agriculture, for example, or actually finding ways to mitigate in various ways, to have social, economic, or environmental progress without women, without half the population of the world that is most impacted by some of the most serious conditions, is unfathomable.
There's a saying that begins, if you want to help a village, give a woman a cow. Giving women the tools and skills to earn a living for themselves is the starting point for helping the community as a whole. But here are some troubling facts from the United Nations. 2 out of 3 illiterate adults are women. Violence against women and girls is a global pandemic. Half of all women are in low-paying, insecure jobs. Women have unequal access to economic assets such as land and credit. The woman at the United Nations in charge of defending human rights herself remembers the insult and pain she experienced trying to make her way in her career.
It was extremely difficult. I was trebly discriminated as a woman. When I qualified with the law degree, then I went to lawyers for employment, and they said, yes, but what if you fall pregnant? So discrimination as a woman. And on race, the white lawyers said to me, we can't have you giving instructions to white secretaries. So the particular situation in South Africa, the people of color had to struggle extra hard to grab every opportunity to get educated. And one day you serve your community.
How can we make ordinary women aware of their own rights? Because we have a lot of women around the world, whether it's in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, who are well educated and they know about their rights. How do you make the rest of the women aware of their rights in countries where their rights have been violated?
I agree with you that knowledge of rights seems to be owned by the elite or the educated. I come from the continent of Africa, and I'm very concerned to reach every little village in Africa, for instance. I see in social media the new mechanism, the ground for hope on how we can spread messages. And I intend to use this new mechanism to reach out to women in particular, because women are always the poorest of the poor. When there's any disaster, natural or armed conflict, they suffer the most. They're victims of rape. So it's women and children who are at the bottom end when it comes to the financial and economic and climate crises that we are going through. And this is why I'm quite committed to ensuring that we give them the tools to articulate their own demands.
Forbes magazine publishes an annual listing of the world's 100 most powerful women. The most recent top 10 are Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, one of the 19 female heads of state or government; Hillary Clinton, U.S. Secretary of State; Dilma Rousseff, President of Brazil; Indra Nooyi, Chief Executive of PepsiCo; Sheryl Sandberg, Head of Facebook; Melinda Gates, Co-Chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation; Sonia Gandhi, India's National Congress Party President; Michelle Obama, U.S. First Lady; Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund; and Irene Rosenfeld, who heads the American corporation Kraft Foods. Half the world's population is female, but according to a report by the Interparliamentary Union, women today comprise just 19% of the members of parliament worldwide. 30% is considered the minimum for women to constitute an effective minority. According to the Quota Project, run by International IDEA and Stockholm University, a little over 100 countries have quotas for women in their parliaments. In Afghanistan, for example, almost 30% of the seats are reserved for women. But in conservative, patriarchal societies, that representation may not equate with actual power.
Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
And how do women in the United States fare? No woman has ever been elected president, and the 93 women currently in the U.S. Congress hold just 17% of the 535 seats. One of them is Senator Kay Hagan, who started her career in the state legislature of North Carolina and was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2008. She spoke with Perspective's Carla Babb.
Well, Senator Hagan, thank you so much for being with us today.
It is my honor.
In a nation where women's rights are a key part of our foreign policy. Why is it that women just make up 17% of the Congress?
You know, that is a very, very good question, and it's even gotten worse. In 2010, it's the first time in 30 years that women have lost representation in Congress. If you look at the research, women tend to be recruited to run for office. I recruit women each and every day, beginning in elementary to middle school, and I explain the story that I was actually recruited to run for office. And if women need to be recruited, I am recruiting you today. And you know, after the Declaration of Independence was signed, it took us 150 years for women to get the right to vote.
You said you have different perspectives, and I know that you're one of 5 in the Armed Services Committee. How does that affect your decisions and your legislation?
North Carolina has the 3rd largest military footprint in the nation. So I represent many, many active duty and retired veterans in our state. And obviously it's men and women. I want to be sure that women have the same promotional abilities as the men. And so I've been a strong supporter of some of the most recent discussions going on in the military, opening up about 14,000 new job opportunities for women. And this will truly help them from the promotion status. When we put forth nominations for promotions within the military, one of the questions I ask is, how many women are being made generals?
Do you consider yourself a role model for women in the United States?
I consider myself somebody who is doing my job, the one that I worked very hard to get, the one that I'm very proud of, but I also recognize that in many other people's eyes, I am definitely a role model. And I want to be sure that I use the fact that I am a role model in working with especially young girls to say, you know, you've got to study hard. We've got to have more females involved in science, technology, engineering, and math. That's where the jobs, the innovation, the creativity, the new jobs that are going to be created in our country. And I want to be sure women have a seat, not only at the table, but as the CEO and at the board level.
You have been a working mother, you're proud of that, and there are still critics that say this is a bad thing for the United States. Women working are giving them less time with their children. What would you say to people who say that?
I'd say they're not in the real world. And I think it depends on what fits you, your family, and your model. But when you look at the economy of the United States today, there are very few families that can afford to have just one parent working today. Although I know we have a lot of single parents, I also know that dual parent incomes is probably sort of what's needed today. I have 3 children, 2 girls and a son, and I couldn't be a more proud mother. But I also know that it does take a lot of work, and you do have to set your priorities. You can't be all things to all people, but you can certainly have a fabulous family life as well as a career.
Do you think there are still issues that are considered women's issues in legislation?
You look at the issues that today in the U.S., women still make 78 cents for a dollar that men make. That's why one of the first bills that I sponsored when I became a U.S. Senator was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, to emphasize that women should get equal pay for equal work. You look at different issues having to do with education and family matters. Women do understand those issues very clearly and understand what needs to be done.
So what would you say to women watching this show who want to get more involved in their governments?
You know, every country is different. And I think the key point, a part of this is economic stability. That if a woman is able to make even a small amount of money and be able to provide for her family, the whole family dynamics change. And so I think that's a big issue that women can bring to the forefront with their government. I just got back from several countries in Africa, and one of the big issues there is trying to prevent the transmission of HIV/AIDS to their unborn children. And right now it's at a 98% effective rate if the women have access to the medicine and actually follow the protocol. And that's where it's an M2M, a mothers to mothers, where the great advocacy is helping these women, women helping women. And I think that's what you will see change on a dynamic standpoint in many of the developing countries, where women get their voice, get actively involved in their communities, and then ultimately their government, and you'll see a huge shift.
That's all for this edition of Perspectives. Next week's program will be devoted to the subject of human rights, including a look at a tribunal in Cambodia that is dealing with crimes against humanity that were committed over 30 years ago. But we'd like to give the last word in today's program to a young voice from Yemen.
As for the participation of women, I think it's still a long way to go. Yemeni women has to fight for their rights. They are not going to give them their rights easily. We have to participate effectively and to take our rights, either political rights or social rights or economic rights or different rights, and even the rights of expressions and these things.
Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.